Hunter finds abandoned baby in the forest and is shocked to see a giant snake wrapped around him. There was a very ancient forest with wide-trunked trees and exposed roots that looked like arms intertwined in the soil. The place had a mysterious yet serene air about it. Morning fog drifted among the highest leaves, creating a translucent veil that dimmed the early sunlight. Birds emitted soft, spaced-out chirps. Small rodents darted beneath the undergrowth, and everything seemed to move in silent harmony. It was that time of year when moisture made the ground soft, so a careless step could form muddy puddles along the narrow trails. That morning, Jack, a simple man, walked through the area with his rifle resting on his shoulders. He did not hunt for sport, but to secure some food or protect the region from dangerous animals that might appear. He had never been a lover of hunting itself, but lived far from the city and depended on the land's resources. He was cautious and knew how to distinguish every typical sound of the forest. He listened to the wind rustling the leaves, to the crackling of twigs, to the low cooing of shy birds. Sometimes he would stop to examine a fallen trunk where fungi grew, or to study tracks left by nocturnal creatures. As he moved, something unusual caught his attention. A very soft cry, almost a whimper, coming from a denser part of the forest. He stopped immediately, holding his breath to make sure of what he'd heard. He stayed like that for long moments, waiting for the sound to repeat. Indeed, he heard it again. It was a fragile cry, as if the life producing it lacked the strength to cry any louder. Jack's heart began to race. It sounded a lot like a baby's cry, which made no sense in such a deserted place. Forgetting the search for wild animals, he started following the delicate sound, stepping carefully so as not to make a noise that could frighten whoever was there. With each step, the crying grew closer and a bit clearer. A breeze gently moved the leaves, almost as if inviting him to continue. He had no idea what he would find, and that filled him with anxiety. It wasn't unheard of to occasionally encounter a lost traveler, but he had never heard of a baby in the middle of the woods. After walking around a few taller trees and ducking under twisted branches, he reached a patch of ground covered with fallen leaves. There he saw a scene that took his breath away. A baby only a few months old, lying on the damp earth, letting out weak, irregular cries. Jack couldn't fathom how that was possible. For a few seconds he was paralyzed, not knowing what to do. Then he noticed something that made the situation even more frightening. A rather large snake was coiled around the child's torso, squeezing dangerously. Jack was so startled that he dropped his rifle on the ground. It took all his mental strength not to act impulsively and accidentally harm the baby himself, because a sudden move could make the snake tighten even more. His hands were sweating and a slight tremor ran through his arms. He had to think fast. The baby's cries were becoming weaker, a sign that it was running out of air. If he hesitated too long, a tragedy could happen. He decided not to use the rifle because firing would be too risky. He thought about grabbing a long stick to pull the snake away, but feared it would react immediately. He also carried a large pocket knife in a side pocket. In other situations he had dealt with snakes before, but never with a child involved. He swallowed hard and very slowly knelt beside the animal, trying not to scare it further. With his left hand, he gently pulled the snake's tail, hoping it would loosen its grip. It didn't help much. The creature tensed its muscular coils and turned its head to face Jack, who shuddered at the sight of those dark eyes. The snake's squeeze on the baby's little body seemed to tighten as the crying became even more muffled. Jack realized he had to take a quick, precise action. With his right hand, he drew the pocket knife, opening its blade. He planted his knee firmly on the ground. He tried to slip the metal along the side of the snake's body, near the spot where it was coiled around the child, being extremely careful not to injure the baby. Every millimeter counted. He could almost hear his own heartbeat pounding so hard. At the blade's first contact with its scales, the snake jerked in spasms. Jack used his strength to pull part of the animal's body away from the child. After a few seconds of struggle, he finally managed to slightly cut the snake's back. It thrashed violently, which loosened the coils for a brief instant. Jack seized that moment and pulled the snake to the side, freeing the baby's torso, which dropped lightly onto the leaves. The snake writhed once more, but then retreated away from the man and the baby, disappearing into the dense vegetation. Jack didn't dare chase it. His focus turned to the infant, who could barely muster the strength to cry. The baby's body was trembling, showing red marks on its chest, neck, and arms, evidence of the snake's strong grip. Jack picked the child up. He felt the child's faint warmth and found it hard to hold back the lump forming in his throat. He had never seen anything so pitiful. He needed to get the boy to a safe place without delay. At the same time, he tried to make sense of how anyone could leave a baby in the forest, exposed to wild animals and the harshness of the environment. With firm steps, though not running so as not to jostle the baby, he headed toward his cabin, which was only a few minutes away if he walked briskly. His heart was still pounding, and his thoughts raced without finding any logical explanation for this abandonment. Who would do something so cruel? Could the mother have faced some tragedy? Or worse, had it been intentional? As he mulled over these questions, he pressed the baby against his chest, trying to provide some warmth and comfort. The child continued to whimper, now slightly less muffled but still very weak, as though exhausted by the ordeal and lack of air. Upon arriving at the cabin, Jack pushed the door open forcefully. The noise echoed through the rooms, and his wife, Anna, appeared in the living room with alarm written on her face. She wore a tired look, with dark circles beneath her eyes, marks of a long-standing exhaustion. She watched as Jack came in, trembling and holding something carefully in his arms. When she saw it was a baby, her mouth fell open, and she was speechless for a few seconds, trying to process what she was seeing. Out of breath, Jack quickly told her he had found the child in the woods, wrapped up in a giant snake, nearly suffocated. Anna clasped her hands over her face in shock, then rushed over to take the baby into her arms. The moment she held him, she felt the small body still trembling, noticing the red marks the snake had left. Her expression grew tearful, and her mind drifted to a painful past that haunted her day and night, the memory of the son she had lost years before. This tiny boy reopened a wound that had never truly healed, but also awakened a strong protective instinct in her. Anna held the baby against her chest, realizing he was still crying, though with little strength. She asked no questions at that moment, sensing there was no time to waste. She told Jack to call for help while she looked for a clean cloth and heated some water to clean the child. She was afraid the baby could be internally injured from the tight squeeze. Jack tried to call the police and emergency medical services, but the local phone line, often unstable, took a while to get a signal. When he finally got through, he described the situation, pleading for immediate assistance. His voice trembled over the phone, as the story was so out of the ordinary that he wasn't sure if they would believe him right away. Within about 20 minutes, a makeshift ambulance arrived, accompanied by a simple police car. The paramedics came inside, saw the baby's condition, and began checking his pulse and breathing. They found he was weak, but had no broken bones. There was a risk of internal injuries, so they decided to take him to the hospital in the nearest town, a small place, but staffed with doctors at least somewhat prepared for emergencies. Anna, already attached to the baby, insisted on going along. Jack stayed behind, as the police wanted him to show them where everything had happened in the forest. At the hospital, Anna felt a surge of emotion as she watched every procedure performed on the child. He was placed on a gurney, carefully examined, and nurses tried to calm him while checking his temperature and vital signs. They noticed signs of dehydration and possible evidence of mistreatment or neglect, as he was much thinner than he should be at his apparent age. This was something to be confirmed with further tests. Throughout this process, Anna never stayed more than a few steps away from him. She felt that if she left the baby, he might feel even more forsaken. In her heart, a nurturing fire was reignited. She recalled her lost son, David, and somehow caring for this little one felt like an act of love fate had unexpectedly granted her. Meanwhile, Jack guided two officers through the woods. He showed them the fallen leaves, the exact spot where he had seen the baby and the snake, and pointed out some large, heavy footprints in the wet soil. Observing those footprints, one of the officers noted they likely belonged to an adult male and hadn't been there very long since it had rained the day before and the ground was still quite soft. To Jack, that indicated the child was abandoned intentionally, though it was hard to grasp why anyone would do such a thing. The police took photos, jotted down details, and said they would send the information to the central station. One of them, named Carter, was more experienced and seemed deeply concerned, agreeing that it was a strange and alarming case. After a few hours, Jack returned to the cabin, still shaken by what he had experienced. The image of the snake squeezing the baby would not leave his mind. He had seen many things in the wild, but nothing had prepared him for that. Worried, He wondered if Anna and the baby were all right at the hospital. He thought of his wife and how she had suffered in the past. They had a son, David, who had died in a car accident just a few weeks after birth. It was a tragedy that had shattered both their lives. Anna sank into deep grief, and Jack felt relentless guilt, for he had been driving that night. Since then, each had tried to live with the pain in their own way. The sudden arrival of a baby in such dire circumstances touched old wounds, but also reignited a glimmer of hope that there was still something good to be done. At the hospital, tests showed the baby had no broken bones, but was very weak due to lack of proper nutrition. He would need care, hydration, and observation for several days. The medical team was moved by Anna's story, which she told multiple times, how the baby had been rescued. The nurses could not fathom how a baby had ended up there alone. During this time, Officer Carter arrived, having been at the forest site with Jack. He listened to the doctor's assessment, exchanged a few words with Anna, and filed a detailed report. He said they would start searching for any possible relatives, but with no solid information on the baby's background, it would be a challenge. Anna, who could barely sleep, stayed at the hospital crib's side, monitoring the child's every breath. From time to time, she closed her eyes and saw David's face, the son she had lost. The rescued baby was about the same size as David had been at birth, yet he bore an expression of suffering that tore at her heart. She asked herself who could abandon such a defenseless being to the cruelty of predators. She also wondered why fate had placed this situation in her and Jack's path after all they had been through. After 2 days in the hospital, the boy showed improvement. He started to feed more eagerly, though he still required a special bottle with the formula the doctor recommended. As there was no sign of any family or guardians, and the police had found no missing child report that matched his description, the hospital staff consulted the local child protective services. They decided that once he was discharged, the baby would be sent to a shelter or into someone's temporary care until the investigation advanced. Anna felt a pang in her chest at the thought. She volunteered to keep the baby for a while, explaining that he already seemed accustomed to her and Jack. She feared that if he went to a shelter, it could worsen his trauma. Initially, the idea seemed unusual, but given the circumstances, and with Jack's agreement since he also showed he was responsible, Child Protective Services allowed it under the condition of regular visits and constant reporting. So the couple took the baby to their cabin. On the car ride, Anna held the child, making sure he stayed warm. Jack drove with the tension of a man reliving painful memories at the wheel, but he tried to focus on arriving safely. When they reached the house, he felt a surge of emotion, realizing that now they had someone so young depending on them. For years, the house had been filled with a heavy silence, born of the sadness that gripped them after David's death. Every room held memories, and Anna had never mustered the courage to dismantle the nursery they had prepared for their son. Everything remained practically untouched. That was where she placed the small boy, as it was the only space set up for a baby. The walls had a soft color, and the wooden crib Jack had built during Anna's pregnancy was still there. Seeing it used again brought a mixture of pain and relief to Anna. She felt an urge to cry, but held it in because she had to tend to the boy resting there. He was still without a known name, and now he received devoted care. Jack installed a simple heater for colder nights, and Anna gathered diapers, bottles, and some baby clothes donated by neighbors or purchased from baby supply shops. They weren't wealthy, but they did everything they could to ensure the baby's comfort. During those early days, the two took turns feeding and changing him, since the child woke multiple times a night, sometimes crying, sometimes just seeming startled. More than once, Anna woke with a jolt, fearing something might be smothering him, haunted by the image of the snake wrapped around him. Each time she made sure he was breathing well, checking if he only cried for attention or food. This demanding routine curiously brought back a certain energy to the cabin, for it was no longer so quiet. The baby's cries reminded them that a new life was there, needing attention. Jack also felt the change. Before, he would spend days wandering in the forest, checking traps, gathering firewood, and looking for food. Now he had to return more frequently to help Anna, especially when she became exhausted. Often, he would sit in the living room holding the boy in his arms and gently rocking him. Feeling that warmth, the baby usually closed his eyes and drifted off, or else stared curiously at Jack as if trying to understand who he was. Deep down, Jack thought of his first son, and felt a tightness in his chest. He wondered whether he deserved a second chance at raising a child after what had happened, but each time he looked into the baby's eyes, he felt a tenderness he never thought he would feel again. Days went by and Detective Carter came back for news. He spoke with Jack and Anna, saying some people in a distant village mentioned seeing a suspicious man carrying something in his arms that night, but there was no reliable information. He also explained that no one had reported a missing baby matching that description. It was a mystery requiring patience. He asked how the child was doing. Anna said he had gained weight, though he still needed medical care. She also mentioned that they hadn't given him a name yet, unsure if it was right to do so without knowing his real identity. Carter replied there was no legal barrier to calling the child something temporary. That same day, Anna suggested to Jack that they name the boy Ethan. She liked that it was a simple, strong name, and she'd read somewhere that it carried a meaning related to courage and resilience. Jack agreed. They needed a more personal way to refer to him. From then on, both called the baby Ethan. Sometimes Anna would murmur his name as she rocked him to sleep, stroking his tiny hands. She realized it calmed her too. She noticed that each day the little one became more relaxed, making funny little noises and spending moments quietly studying the environment, as if trying to understand his new home. As weeks passed, Child Protective Services visited the cabin regularly. They checked if the environment was safe, if it was warm enough, and if Anna and Jack had the means to meet Ethan's needs. They were impressed by the attentive care the couple provided. Their notes reflected that the boy seemed to be improving continuously, and for now there was no better place for him, since no biological family member had come forward. The investigation remained pending, and eventually they would consider a long-term plan. Behind this newfound peace, Jack and Anna were constantly afraid someone would come to take Ethan away. In truth, they knew he wasn't legally theirs, and that a single official decision could change everything. Still, they couldn't neglect him, because his life was in their hands. Anna woke multiple times a night to check that he was breathing and covered. She carried him around the house, talking about day-to-day matters, as if trying to convey a sense of security. One time, Jack found Anna sitting in Ethan's room, holding a small garment that had belonged to their lost son. She was silently crying. He approached quietly, placed his hand on her shoulder, and stayed by her side without saying much. He understood that memories of David resurfaced even more strongly now that another baby lived under their roof. Anna didn't blame him for anything, but the pain was still lodged in both their hearts. In some way, caring for Ethan reopened those wounds, but also offered a path toward healing them. Both recognized this, though it was hard to express in words. Time passed, and Ethan reached 4 or 5 months in their care, still with no sign of any biological relative. In each medical checkup, he was shown to be developing well. He now reacted to stimuli, sometimes smiled at Anna or Jack, and kicked his little legs more vigorously. Occasionally he was startled by loud noises, but he calmed down quickly if someone picked him up. Meanwhile, Carter dug deeper into the investigation, finding clues that a man named Robert, who lived with a woman named Sarah, might be connected to the baby's abandonment. They lived in a remote home and were known for trouble. Some neighbors reported hearing fights, heavy drinking, and even a baby crying at night. It was nothing solid, but enough for Carter to keep an eye on them. He chose not to alarm Jack and Anna yet, needing solid proof. However, he suspected strongly that Sarah was Ethan's mother, given that some people vaguely recalled seeing her pregnant, though nothing was certain. As Carter reviewed local records, he found no official documentation that they'd had a child, suggesting the boy had never been registered and underscoring severe negligence. Carter began to keep watch on the house, gathering evidence. He was nearly convinced that if Robert were pressured, he'd confess to abandoning the baby, which would explain the large footprints Jack had seen near the spot where Ethan was found. Life at the cabin continued. Anna decided to reorganize Ethan's room, packing up some of David's keepsakes that now stirred her emotions too sharply. She told Jack this was not about forgetting their deceased son, but about making room for what was happening in the present. Jack supported her, though it was painful for him as well. He noticed that each time Anna rocked the baby or spoke to him, she seemed stronger. There was a sparkle in her eyes he had not seen in a long time. The same was true for himself, as he no longer felt so hopeless. He still had nightmares about the accident and flashes of that day he found Ethan almost smothered, but now he woke knowing he could do something good for this child. The months dragged on, filled with feedings, cleanings, checkups, and short playtimes in the yard. Jack still made short trips into the forest for wood, worried about leaving Anna alone for long. The couple's daily rhythm revolved around caring for Ethan, ensuring the house was warm enough, preparing formula, and making sure he was safe. Their small local community offered them some support, with neighbors donating clothes or occasional meals in jars, hoping everything would work out and that Ethan would thrive there. Some, however, whispered doubts about whether this grief-stricken couple was emotionally capable of raising someone else's child. Jack and Anna, for their part, didn't let such talk trouble them. They knew that what truly mattered were their actions and the love they were giving the boy. Finally, after an intense investigation, Carter found evidence linking Robert to the abandonment. An analysis of footprints confirmed that boots found in Robert's home matched the footprints photographed in the forest. A witness also claimed to have seen Robert carrying something that looked like a wrapped baby on the same night Ethan was left there. With a warrant, Carter arrested Robert and Sarah. During questioning, they gave conflicting statements. Sarah, visibly mentally unstable, said she didn't know where her child was. Faced with the evidence, Robert eventually confessed he couldn't stand the baby's crying, which was a nuisance to their lifestyle, and decided to get rid of him in the forest, believing someone else might find him, or that nature would simply end the problem. His coldness shocked even the most seasoned police officers. This confession cleared up almost all the mystery. The baby was Sarah's, never officially registered. She and Robert lived amid constant fights and drinking, and the child had been a victim of absolute neglect. That he had survived and been rescued by Jack was nearly a miracle. With this confirmation, the next step involved Child Protective Services and the family court, potentially stripping Sarah of parental rights given the proof of abandonment and mistreatment. Robert also faced charges of attempted homicide, child endangerment, and other offenses. As for Ethan, this practically meant he would never be returned to his biological parents, for they offered no safe environment. Carter compiled all the paperwork, reports, and photos and brought them to a hearing before the judge assigned to the case. He described how Jack and Anna had taken in the baby, stressing their consistent care and responsibility so far. Child Protective Services, through its reports, affirmed its favorable impression of the couple. This opened the way for Jack and Anna to request Ethan's official adoption if they wished. The judge decided to grant them a stronger temporary guardianship first, allowing the child to remain with them legally, while the adoption process went through interviews, paperwork, and all the red tape required by law. When Anna received the news, she burst into tears of relief. She had been terrified she might lose Ethan any day. Jack also silently shed tears, feeling that somehow life was giving them a chance to heal a part of their past. Ethan, in his innocence, just smiled at the faces of the adults protecting him, having no idea what was happening. In the following months, they underwent the adoption procedures. They had psychological evaluations, visits from social workers, income reviews, and statements from neighbors and acquaintances about Jack and Anna's character. It was a stressful period, as there was always the fear that some argument might arise against them. Yet everything indicated their unwavering dedication to the boy, and there were no relatives disputing custody. In time, the judge called a final hearing to decide if the adoption would be made official and if Ethan would legally bear Jack and Anna's names. On that day, Anna wore simple but neat clothes and dressed Ethan in clean, tidy baby clothes. Jack drove to the courthouse, his hands sweating on the wheel. The short trip felt endless because of their anxiety. Once there, they entered a modest room, where the judge, a representative from the district attorney's office, and a psychologist listened again to the facts of the case. Carter was present, confirming the story of abandonment and mistreatment by the biological parents. Child Protective Services emphasized that from day one, Ethan had been well cared for at the cabin, recovering from health issues caused by previous neglect. The judge carefully went through each document, nodding as he read. Finally, he spoke calmly, saying it was in the child's best interest to remain in a stable, loving home. He declared that he granted Jack and Anna the right to adopt Ethan officially. He recognized their hard work and stated that from that moment on, Ethan would be their lawful child. Anna covered her mouth with her hand to stifle a gasp of joy. Jack bowed his head, wiping away tears discreetly. Carter smiled faintly and wished them well. A court clerk asked for their signatures, and in a few minutes it was done. Leaving the courthouse, Jack and Anna felt an enormous weight lift from their shoulders. They looked at Ethan, held in Anna's arms and busy with a small wooden toy. The sun shone bright outside, reflecting off the streets. The world seemed more vivid, as though, at last, after so many trials, they could move forward without fear. They returned to the cabin, where they arranged Ethan's room with an even more personal touch. Anna put away some of David's things, feeling that while she would never stop missing her first son, she no longer had to remain trapped in endless sorrow. Now, she held in her arms a life that demanded devotion, and that devotion brought fresh purpose. Time went on. Robert was sentenced to a lengthy term for child endangerment and attempted homicide. Sarah was also punished, including mandatory treatment, as she struggled with substance abuse and showed no capacity to raise a child. With no further legal obstacles, Ethan was officially in the care of his new parents. The cabin was no longer just a place of heavy memories, but became a scene of childish laughter, nighttime cries, and everyday learning. Their life now revolved around diapers, bottles, medical appointments, and outdoor play. As months turned into years, Ethan grew. He learned to crawl, then to toddle around unsteadily, and finally to run through the house uttering simple words. At each milestone, Jack and Anna showed unwavering dedication. When he started speaking, he formed little sounds, calling Mama or Papa in his childish way, and both parents were deeply moved. They also realized that when Ethan was older, they would eventually have to tell him the truth about his past. They wondered how best to approach it, because they did not want to hide the fact that he was abandoned, but they also wanted to protect him from trauma. They decided to wait until he was old enough to understand, believing that what mattered most now was the love they gave him. In the yard, Jack built a small wooden fence to create a safer play area, so Ethan wouldn't wander too close to the forest or slip down any steep drops. There the boy discovered insects, chased butterflies, and laughed as he watched his father chop wood. Anna, who tended a small garden, taught him to gently touch the leaves, avoid getting pricked by thorns, and appreciate the wonders of nature around them. Life took on a simple, peaceful atmosphere that Ethan would never have experienced had he stayed with his biological parents, entangled in conflict and abuse. One day, when Ethan was already walking well and speaking in short sentences, Anna took him to town for the first time to visit the local market. The boy was fascinated by the hustle and bustle, the colors, the scent of fruit, and the animals some residents brought along. He clung to his mother's hand but let his eyes roam everywhere. It touched Anna to see his reaction to such simple things, reminding her that not long ago he could have died alone in the forest. She sometimes teared up remembering all they had been through to get here. Back at the cabin by late afternoon, they found Jack stoking the wood stove to bake a loaf of homemade bread. He liked experimenting in the kitchen. Ethan ran up, curious about the delicious smell. Jack lifted him and explained in simple terms that he was making dough for the family to eat. Anna watched them from nearby, recalling her overwhelming joy on the day she signed the adoption papers. She felt certain their home was now complete. As time passed, Ethan wanted to explore further beyond the yard. Jack, aware of potential dangers, always accompanied him when they ventured into the thicker parts of the woods. Gradually, Jack taught him which paths were safe, how to spot small animal tracks, and how to stay clear of muddy areas. The child was inquisitive, pointing to everything and asking questions with his eyes that he still couldn't verbalize. This was how his father showed him gently that the forest was not evil, just a place that demanded respect and caution. Anna also used quiet moments to tell Ethan stories, many of which she invented from snippets of real life. She told him about a little bird that lost its mother, but found a new home with other birds. Ethan listened intently, sometimes laughing, sometimes furrowing his brow, trying to understand. When he fell silent for too long, Anna would stroke his head, asking if he was tired. Often he would rest his head on her shoulder, feeling safe. For her, it was a chance to transform every painful memory of the past into something meaningful in the present. Meanwhile, Jack repaired an old rocking chair and placed it on the porch. So on clear nights when the stars were visible, he sat with Ethan on his lap, pointing out twinkling lights in the sky, even if he didn't know the constellation's official names. He'd say things like, "See that bigger star? It looks like it's winking at you." The boy would smile, not yet grasping what a constellation was. For Ethan, it was enough to be there with his father, seeing beautiful things overhead. Every new sunrise brought a more vibrant light into the cabin. If in the past it had been a place of sorrow and silent tears, now it was brimming with a child's laughter, toy noises, clanging pots, and the quick patter of little feet. Ethan, thriving, became the focus of the couple's attention. Carter, who occasionally sent word, said he was glad the child was developing well, no longer tied to the people who nearly cost him his life. The law had done its part, and now it was up to this new family to go forward, bound by love and safety. One late spring afternoon, Jack and Anna sat on the porch, watching Ethan play with some small stones in the yard. The boy stacked them, then knocked them over, laughing and turning to his parents for help rebuilding them. Anna stood up, went over to him, and showed him how to balance the stones one on top of the other. Jack joined in, and all three played together, doing something so simple yet deeply meaningful. The sun illuminated the tree leaves, and the faint chirping of crickets could be heard in the distance. A sense of peace enveloped them. It seemed that all the drama they had lived through had led them to this moment. The child who had almost lost his life now was part of a family that loved him unconditionally. Seeing the pile of stones tumble, Ethan looked to his parents and stretched out his little arms, asking for help in gathering the scattered pieces of gravel. Anna got down on her knees, smiling as she helped him pick them up, patiently showing how to balance them. Jack also knelt. Together, they rebuilt the little towers, the sun's last rays shining on them. In that instant, Anna and Jack were reminded of everything that had happened since Jack heard the faint cry in the forest. They thought of the snake that nearly killed the baby, the desperate condition of the child, Robert's confession, and Sarah's neglect. It was difficult to comprehend how something so tragic could have led to a brand new opportunity for them to become parents again. But there Ethan was, alive and happy, learning something new every day. As dusk painted the sky in shades of red, Anna picked Ethan up and rocked him gently while gazing at his face. He giggled, pointing at the colorful clouds. Jack, for a moment, remembered his first son, David, and felt a pang of sorrow but also a deep gratitude for having found a path forward. He approached Anna and wrapped his arms around both her and Ethan, feeling that the emptiness in his life was finally filled with meaning and love. That night, after putting Ethan to bed, Anna and Jack stayed in the kitchen, lit by a small oil lamp. The aroma of warm soup filled the air, and a peaceful hush prevailed. She held Jack's hand and whispered, asking if he truly believed everything would be fine from then on. He looked down at the worn wooden floor, took a deep breath, and replied that even if new problems arose, they would face them together, like a real family. Anna agreed, and the two exchanged a knowing, supportive look. For many, it would be an unusual story. A baby abandoned in the woods, saved by a hunter who could never have imagined such an encounter, eventually adopted by a couple scarred by a deep loss. But in that modest cabin, what mattered was that Ethan's presence gave new meaning to lives that had been swallowed by grief. The baby, who learned to smile again after such a cruel start, also gave Jack and Anna a renewed ability to love without fear. Thus their life moved forward, each day adding another chapter to a story that proved even the darkest twists of fate could lead to the purest joys. With Robert and Sarah in prison and the adoption finalized, nothing else threatened Ethan's safety. Carter sent a final letter, informing them that the criminal case was closed, that there were no grounds for appeal, and that all guardianship processes had been settled. He wished the couple a long and happy life, mentioning that in all his years on the force, he rarely encountered such a heartwarming outcome. Jack read the letter, smiled, and tucked it inside a book, thinking about sharing it with Ethan when he was old enough to understand the story behind it. A few months later, on a pleasantly sunny day, Anna carried Ethan to a small nearby lake where the water was so clear it looked like a mirror. She wanted to show him the fish swimming near the shore, enjoying the sunlight. The boy squirmed excitedly, dipping his hands in the water while Anna held him so he wouldn't lean too far in. Jack looked on, ready to intervene if needed. Then they sat on a large rock from which they could see the forest in the distance. They took in all that green, silent expanse, full of secrets they knew so well, but now from a different perspective. Not as a tragic place, but as the backdrop where they had begun writing a new life. Eventually they headed back to the cabin, its ever-open door a symbol of warm family welcome. Anna laid Ethan down for a nap, and Jack started splitting wood for the stove. As he worked, he could hear the soft laughter of the boy in the other room, half asleep, but still amused by some small discovery. Jack closed his eyes for a second, recalling the day he had heard that weak cry in the woods. He wondered how different everything would have been had he ignored it, or not heard it at all. Ethan might not have survived, and the family that now thrived would never have formed. Jack smiled lightly and continued chopping wood, feeling the breeze on his face. Each swing of the axe reminded him that life goes on, and that there is always hope for a new beginning. The little cabin, simple and surrounded by wilderness, had become a true home, where past pain coexisted with present joy, a strength that kept darkness at bay. Inside, Anna hummed a gentle lullaby to soothe Ethan, who soon dozed off, safe, unaware that not long before, he had hovered on the brink of life and death. In the following years, Ethan's milestones, first time running without falling, first clear word, mama, curiosity about trees and small animals, and fascination with the stars, were cause for celebration. Jack and Anna never forgot how fortunate they were to have heard his cry in the forest. They looked on as he developed, day by day, protected and cared for, escaping the tragic fate he'd nearly faced. They never stopped thinking of their first son, David, but now that memory was no longer paralyzing. Instead, Ethan's presence showed them that life can be unexpectedly cruel at times, but also unexpectedly generous. Their love had grown beyond what they thought possible, filling their home with new purpose. By the time Ethan was old enough to form longer sentences, he would often wake up early, run into his parents' room, and jump on the bed, demanding attention. Anna would wake with a start, but would smile at her son's excitement. Jack would stretch, pick the boy up, and start the day with that infectious energy. Together they made breakfast, sharing fruit and homemade bread, chatting about the day's plans. It was all so normal, so routine, that it was almost unbelievable how fate had once upended all their expectations of life in the forest. When evening came, they had a ritual of telling stories, sometimes spontaneously invented, sometimes inspired by everyday events. A little squirrel searching for food before winter, or a hurt bird that recovered with the help of other animals. Ethan listened with wide eyes, leaning his head whenever the tale got dramatic. Jack and Anna loved to watch him react to these tales, and they often wondered how they would eventually share with him his own powerful, real story. For the moment, though, their priority was ensuring he felt happy and secure. On the outside, the cabin still looked the same, its wood weathered by the years, smoke curling from the chimney in cold weather, and rough terrain all around. But on the inside, it was a completely different place, each corner touched by a child's presence. Wooden toys Jack had made were scattered about, and little boxes decorated by Anna held Ethan's small belongings. Most notably, the rooms echoed with laughter, a sound that banished the sorrow that once lingered in the walls. On rainy days, they stayed indoors listening to the raindrops overhead, while Anna gave Ethan scraps of fabric for simple collages. On sunny days, they played in the yard, and carefully they ventured along safe forest paths so he could observe birds and butterflies. And so their story took shape, a hunter finding an abandoned baby, saving him from death, and with a grieving mother who had lost her own child, deciding to give that boy a home. Their past sorrow, while never forgotten, turned into a memory that no longer stole their smiles. They often still thought of David, wondering how he would have looked if he'd grown up, but now they could speak of him without lapsing into utter sadness. With Ethan's presence, they understood that life could continue in ways both harsh and kind. Ultimately, the love they chose to give blossomed, filling their home with hope and purpose. On the anniversary of Ethan's official adoption, they decided to host a small gathering. They invited Carter, a few neighbors, and a handful of others who knew Ethan's story. They baked simple cakes, served juice, and hung a few homemade decorations. The boy, delighted by all the commotion, ran about without really understanding that everyone was celebrating his place in the family. Carter arrived in the late afternoon, smiling when he saw Ethan healthy, lively, and chatting away in his toddler's speech. Anna thanked him once more for all he had done, giving him a friendly hug. The officer admitted that in his line of work, it was rare to see such a happy ending, and that alone made his job feel lighter. As the sun set, the group gathered around a makeshift table in the yard to share a celebratory moment. Ethan was in Anna's arms, eyes shining. Jack cut the cake, handing out slices to the small crowd. The mood was joyful. Everyone knew just how close Ethan had come to losing his life, but now he was enjoying a normal childhood, loved by people who genuinely cared for him. Anna hugged Jack, and Ethan snuggled between them, giggling. The couple shared a look of genuine happiness and unity. If there was ever proof that fate can act in mysterious ways, this was it. When the guests departed, the cabin returned to its usual calm. No longer a somber quiet, but the gentle hush of a loving home at rest. Anna tucked Ethan into his crib, smoothing his hair until he drifted off with a peaceful expression. Jack leaned in, watching his son and feeling a wave of emotion at the thought of what might have been had he not stepped in that day. He patted Ethan's cheek gently, grateful he had arrived in time. Then he embraced Anna, and they went to bed, exhausted but fulfilled. In the days and years that followed, Ethan would continue to grow, face new challenges like any child, and Jack and Anna would be there to guide him. Eventually, when the time was right, they would explain the truth of his origins, that love is not about blood ties, but about choices and genuine affection. One day they would tell him that he was found in the woods in a dreadful situation, and that if a brave hunter hadn't heard his faint cries, his story might have ended very differently. But for now, they preferred to keep it as a story in their hearts, reminding themselves nightly of the power of caring for another. And so the lives of Jack, Anna, and Ethan went on, intertwined by chance and strengthened by simple moments of great meaning. The forest, once the backdrop to a tragic abandonment, became a symbol of rebirth. The guilt and grief Jack and Anna had carried for their lost child found a path to healing in the bright eyes and laughter of a new son. Perhaps they would never find a clear answer for the strange turns of fate, but in that little cabin, they were certain that love and care can triumph even in the darkest of situations. It was that love that saved a baby from a cruel fate and became the light that would illuminate Jack and Anna's future forever. Anyone passing by the cabin would see a little boy running around the yard, laughing and calling for his parents. They would see a simple but devoted man repairing fences and a gentle-eyed woman guiding her son with patience. If anyone asked for their story, they would hear an extraordinary tale of a hunter rescuing an abandoned baby. But above all, they would find a home brimming with love and gratitude, where the sorrows of the past were overcome by the strength of a bond nothing could break. The child who was once nearly suffocated by a snake in the silent forest had become the link that gave new meaning to Jack and Anna's existence forever. As Jack, Anna, and Ethan's story draws to a close, we are reminded that even in the most difficult circumstances, love, courage, and care can transform lives. This is a journey of overcoming, hope, and new beginnings. It's inspiring to see how a simple action can change everything. Just as Jack chose to act at the right time, may we also choose the path of love and empathy. If this story touched your heart, leave a comment below sharing what moved you the most or what you learned from it. Don't forget to like the video. This helps us bring messages like this to more people. And if you're not yet subscribed to the channel, go ahead and subscribe now and turn on notifications so you don't miss any of our next inspiring stories. Thank you so much for watching, and see you in the next video.